Okay, our topic is the scientist's faith journeys, and I'm going to dive right in because I've got so much material that I'm pushing it to be done by 8:30. So I want you to have all the time you need to hear from these different scientists. I am going to just do a couple of slides here to start with, just setting the stage in the context of the whole issue of people and their faith journeys and how that interacts with science. Science is a process of gaining knowledge about reality, and I put a capital R there because when we think of reality, we're like, it's more than just, what's around us to our five senses that we're trying to discover. Faith is also a way, God's revelation is a way to gain knowledge about reality. And there are times and places where these two may seem to be in conflict, or people are perceiving them to be in conflict. And that doesn't necessarily have to be so, though. I do know from personal experience, though, that there's a lot of messaging out there in our culture. My husband and I love to watch like Nova science documentaries and stuff like that. We're just, when we're ready to relax on a weekend, we're like, oh, which one shall we watch? The one about Jupiter? Super fun. But I've noticed as I've watched those that, woven throughout the documentary will be these underlying messages or worldview points that are ideas such as that faith is not a rational thing, or that believing in God is kind of like superstition. And I watched one a couple weeks ago that was equating Christian faith with, belief in mythologies, like believing in Zeus or that type of thing. The idea that faith and science are in conflict, and even to the point of being irreconcilable, is communicated to us sometimes out there in the culture. And then even going so far to say that science has proven that God does not exist. And so the question is, if we want to be a rational person, do we ever even allow ourselves to consider the existence of God? I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that science and its approach to understanding reality involves a really clear-cut process that includes observation, forming hypotheses, testing those using experimental designs, and using rational and logical thinking to build a solid sense of what is the truth of what's being explored there. But of course, it's limited to the five senses. And I put the box up there to kind of say that science itself, and the way it is designed, puts limits on itself.
Is there a message behind the fact that the box has meathead on it?
That's right. I have my message. No. So funny. We do need to keep in mind that that the pursuit of science needs to be distinguished from scientism, that idea that the only way to understand reality is through science, And it needs to be distinguished from materialism, that, all that is the material world. Well, since science limits itself to only what we can understand through our five senses, it's sort of naturally limited to the material world. But does that mean that that's all there is in reality? And then reductionism, where, science breaks things down to the smaller parts. But does that mean that when you look at something in the whole, that all it is the sum of those parts? Or is there more to it? Can there be a spiritual reality? And so if we keep those cautions in mind, I think science and faith can be friends with one another. They can symbiotically help us to understand reality with a capital R in a way that goes together quite nicely. And in fact, I would like to like tip those ideas on their head and say, it may not be that science needs to lead me away from faith. Is it possible? And I'm going to say it absolutely is possible, and I'm going to show a few examples in people's lives that science can lead us into a life of faith when we were not a religious person to begin with. And that's what this presentation explores. And I'm going to be presenting to you 3 different scientists. An example of how science can lead us to faith, I think, is in the Big Bang Theory. This would be just one example, but the Big Bang Theory has come to us in the last century, has been highly pursued. It's been a fascinating field of study ever since Einstein's theory of relativity. And it began, as it was taking shape through the course of the 20th century, and more and more evidence was leading us to believe in the Big Bang, it came to this point of realizing that the universe began with this singularity. And that comports quite well with some information that we've already had coming to us in Scripture. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's my understanding that a lot of atheist scientists, over the years as the Big Bang Theory was being proved, they were thinking, no, we kind of have to prove this wrong, because if we go with the Big Bang and if that's where the evidence leads us, well then what are we going to do? We're going to have to believe there was a beginning to everything, and if we believe there's a beginning to everything, maybe there's a beginner. And so that's one example. And this fellow, Hugh Ross, is the first scientist that I want you to hear from. And his study of cosmology and the Big Bang Theory had a huge impact on him and leading him to faith. He is a Canadian by origin who went to the University of British Columbia, then University of Toronto to get his PhD in astronomy. He was a child prodigy, really, of astronomy. By the time he was 16 years old, he was lecturing at the university, and has really his entire life just gained just a tremendous amount of knowledge about astronomy and multiple other fields that he now communicates through his organization called Reasons to Believe. And you can see the website there, reasons.org. He's written a number of books. Only a few of them are listed at the bottom there. And so let me allow you to hear a few words from him.
Welcome along to the programme. I'm Justin Brierley, the host of Unbelievable, and the guest I'm speaking to today is Dr. Hugh Ross of Reasons to Believe. Welcome along, Hugh.
Thank you.
It's great to have you, and it's just a good chance to share a little bit of your background, your faith journey on today's show. So take us back to the beginning, Hugh. You're a scientist now.
Right.
You're a Christian now.
Right.
But you weren't when you were growing up, were you?
Oh, not at all. I was born, raised, and educated in Canada. My parents were moral, but we only attended church a very few times. But I got into astronomy when I was 7, trying to figure out why the stars are hot. And from the age of 8 onwards, I knew astrophysics would be my future career. Would study a particular discipline every year in some depth. Age 16, I looked at cosmology, the origin structure of the universe. And that's when I realized the evidence was heavily favoring Big Bang cosmology. And with Big Bang cosmology, the universe has a beginning. Therefore, there must be a beginner. So from the age of 16 onwards, I did not doubt the existence of God. But I was skeptical this God that created this vast universe would communicate to us beings on a small speck we call planet Earth. But for the sake of intellectual honesty, I actually went through the holy books of the religions of the world and recognize that of all the different...
I touched it. Sorry, you guys, I was experimenting. Sorry.
Gaining knowledge.
Now, I was trying to figure out how I could see the timestamp on it, but it didn't work.
Oh, yeah, it hasn't, I haven't figured out a way to do that.
Holy books, there was only one that was accurately and consistently predicting future science and future history. And so at age 19, I signed my name in the back of a Gideon Bible, committing my life to Christ. And 8 years later, I met Christians when I arrived on the Caltech campus.
This story is just so interesting because nowadays, most people get the impression that if you start to look at science, you're more likely to be drawn away from any idea that God exists. But for you, quite the opposite. When you started to look at the science, you came from a place of, I guess, agnosticism to actually believing just on the basis of the scientific evidence that there must have been a creator.
Well, when you look at Big Bang cosmology, see, I was studying this at the very time when scientists here in Britain were developing the first of the space-time theorems, which states that the entire universe is traceable back to an actual beginning of space and time, with a causal agent beyond space and time that brings this universe into existence. As I looked at the Eastern religions, they talked about space and time being eternal, not created. And what I saw in Christianity was a story that was different and consistent with the latest discoveries in astrophysics.
And so when you picked up the Bible and started looking through it for yourself, what kind of was the process by which you started to think, well, does that fit with what I know of science?
Well, what surprised me, it was the only holy book that actually spoke of an actual space-time beginning when the universe was created. It's also the only holy book that talked about the universe continuously expanding. And I knew enough about the history of astronomy to realize that was not recorded anywhere else outside of the Bible until the 20th century. For over 2,000 years, the Bible stood alone in stating, we live in a continuously expanding universe, a universe with constant laws of physics, and where one of those laws is a pervasive law of decay, which means we must be living in a universe that progressively gets colder and colder as it gets older and older.
It's really interesting you say this, because most people, I guess, who pick up the Bible don't see those kinds of details in it. Obviously, with your scientist eye on, what led you to the conclusion that some of these discoveries of modern science are in some sense predicted within the pages of Scripture?
Well, it's not that the Bible just says it once. I mean, there's actually 11 different passages which talk about God stretching out the heavens. And it puts it in a variety of different Hebrew verb forms, which means the Bible literally, not figuratively, is speaking about God continuously expanding the universe from the cosmic creation event. You know, that's the heart of Big Bang cosmology.
All right, we're going to get back to Hugh in just a second here. But before we do, I just wanted to orient us really to the argument that was convincing to Hugh Ross. It's called I actually not sure I can pronounce that properly, Calem or Cosmological Argument.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy. And that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, 3 leading cosmologists, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, proved that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
There's Hugh again.
Well, the heavens proclaim the righteousness of God, and all the peoples see his glory. I didn't meet Christians until I was 27 years of age. Didn't get to know any. But the heavens, they spoke to me. And I was born in Montreal. My father had a very successful engineering business there, but he had an unscrupulous financial partner who basically ran off with all the resources of the company. And in one day, my father had to lay off 40 employees, dozens of engineers. And with the last few dollars he had, he took our family out of Montreal and moved us to Vancouver. He couldn't find work because even though he had all these engineers working for him, he didn't have any formal education. And so we had to resettle in Vancouver. We settled in the poorest neighborhood in Vancouver. But it turned out to be a blessing in disguise because I'm on the autistic spectrum. I was not talking. I had very poor motor skills. I couldn't hold a pencil or a pen. And all my parents' friends had diagnosed me as mentally retarded. I would have been put in a special school. We'd stayed in Montreal. But we had settled in this immigrant neighborhood of Vancouver. People from all over the world, refugees. And they were like me. They weren't speaking English. They were learning a new language. So I kind of fit in. But I tell you, I almost failed grade 1 because I couldn't prove that I could read. I couldn't prove that I could do mathematics because I couldn't hold a pencil. And but it was a teacher that held me after school one day and said, "You don't have to talk. I'm just going to ask you questions, nod your head or shake your head." She figured out even though I wasn't talking, I could read. She put me into the 2nd grade. And I don't know what it's like here in the US, but in Canada, they seat you in the classroom according to your academic standing. And so I was in the last chair in grade 2. But I kind of figured out what was going on, and I said, I better learn how to talk. And so I would go home and practice holding a pencil for hours so I could actually make the letters and numbers. And within the grade 2, I was in the 1st chair. Now, also at 7 years of age, I started talking, and I began to ask questions. I remember one night I had a conversation with my parents. Are the stars hot? And they said, son, yes, they are hot. I said, why are they hot? And they said, you better go to the library. So they gave me bus fare. I went all by myself to the Vancouver Public Library, which had a 4 million volume set, and I came home with 5 books on astronomy and physics. In fact, that happened every weekend. I would come home with another set of books. So astronomy captured me and fascinated me ever since I was 7. I knew that was going to be my future career, literally from that point forward. But it wasn't enough for me to study astronomy. I wanted to do astronomy. And so in our neighborhood, there were a lot of drunks. And so I would go around collecting empty beer bottles. They were worth 1.5 cents each. And soda pop bottles were worth 2 cents. So for 7 years, I collected beer bottles and soft drink bottles until I had enough money to buy a telescope mirror and some metal parts. And because my dad was a machinist, he helped me build a telescope. And so from the age of 15 onwards, I had this telescope and I used it to do a research study on variable stars. I joined the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, and they made me the Director of Observations at age 16. And that required me giving lectures at the university, so I started giving lectures. And that helped me with my autism, being able to communicate with people. And but age 16 is also when I'd spent a long study on cosmology, the origin and structure of the universe, and recognized that the Big Bang explanation really was fitting the observations. And so with this Big Bang, that means there's a beginning. If there's a beginning, there's got to be a beginner. So at age 16, I realized there had to be some kind of God behind the universe. So what did I do? I began to read the great philosophers. Started off with Immanuel Kant, René Descartes, but quickly discovered that their ideas about the universe were not comporting with our observations. So I began to look in other sources for insight about this God that was behind the heavens. So I remember looking at the Hindu Vedas, but they were speaking about multiple beginnings for the universe rather than just one. And the idea of the entropy in the universe wasn't fitting what they were saying. And they had the wrong time scale in the universe. The high school I went to was mostly Asians, refugees from Asia, a lot of Buddhists. So I checked out the Buddhist commentaries, basically saying the same thing as Hindus about the universe. Checked out Islam, found that the accounts they had of creation were contradicting one another. Finally, I did check out the Bible. Now, what I told you earlier, I didn't get to know Christians till I was 27. I actually got to see 2 from 30 feet away when I was 11 years of age. They were Gideons that came into our public school. And this is the Gideon Bible I got when I was 11. But I didn't touch it until I was 17. And when I began to go through it, I realized this book is really different. It's clear, it's direct, it's not repetitive. It's not, this appeal to intellectual snobbery. And after studying it for 18 months, I realized I couldn't find a single provable or error contradiction in this book. I found things I didn't understand, but I could not discover any provable error or contradiction, unlike what I found in these other sources. At the same time, I discovered this book in many places was predicting future scientific discoveries. Things like the universe having a space-time beginning, expansion of the universe under constant laws of physics, where one is a pervasive law of decay, which implied that we must live in a universe that gets progressively colder and colder with respect to time. Genesis 1, I realized here's all these events of creation. They're all correctly described. They're all in the correct chronological sequence. Also discovered this book accurately predicted future historical events. And I remember one night at age 19 calculating the probability that these statements about future science and history could have been recorded by people who are not inspired by the one who's in control of history and who created the universe, and recognized that this book had a higher degree of reliability than laws of physics that we trust with our lives literally every minute of the day. And so August 6, 1964, I began praying as I looked over this Gideon Bible. and realize if I make a commitment of my life to Jesus Christ, if I sign my name in the back of this Gideon Bible, I'm committing myself to share my Christian faith with others. And I realized what kind of attack I would come under if I did that. So I literally prayed for about a 5-hour period. But at 1:05 in the morning, I signed my name in the back of this Gideon Bible and said, I don't care what kind of persecution or attack I face, I'm going to be a witness for Christ.
Okay. Before I move on to our next scientist, I just want to stop and allow us to respond and react to what we heard from Hugh Ross. So I'm going to ask you to talk like at the table where you're sitting, and just share with one another what are your thoughts, what are your reactions to his story. Just for a few minutes. All right. This is the hard part, is knowing how to transition back from our conversations. Looks like you guys are having some really good discussion.
Just need a gavel.
Bang, bang. We're gonna move into our next speaker, and his talk is longer. It's about almost a half an hour long. And before I launch into him, I just want to bring up a couple of other arguments that can be convincing to people who are open to rational and logical exploration of what is reality with a capital R. And so the first one would be the design argument, just the basic idea that there is so much appearance of design in nature, throughout nature, at every level, from the cellular level and even smaller, all the way out to the level of the universe and galaxies. And all that design points to a designer. And the second one is the fine-tuning argument, which is based off of the idea that mathematical constants that are used as we describe the universe, such as, in E equals mc squared, which one is the constant? Help me, I'm not a math person.
C.
The C, right? That these are extremely fine-tuned, meaning they are so precise, so incredibly precise, that if you were to move that number just the tiniest fraction, smaller or larger, that the universe itself would never have come into existence. And yet these constants don't seem to be, really dependent on anything other than their contribution to helping make sure that life unfolds, that a universe unfolds that follows the laws of nature that we've got, and that they result in life. We were going to try it, weren't we? Oh, that's all right. I think I'm going to maybe run out of time, so I will just skip the video that's about fine-tuning. And I'll introduce you to Francis Collins. He is the director of the National Institutes of Health. Francis Collins was also the head of the Human Genome Project, where they were analyzing our DNA, which was huge. So impactful on our culture, and so highly respected, that work. He's a member of the National Academy of Medicine, the National Academy of Science. He was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2007, and this is just a short list. The list is long of Francis Collins's credentials in the scientific world. This is a video put on by the Veritas Forum, which they discuss faith and science issues on university campuses. I think this lecture was given at Caltech. And you will see him describing his life story similar to Hugh Ross, but embedding a lot more of the ideas, sort of the thought pattern that he followed. But actually, I'm going to skip that for a second. I wanted to let you know what discussion questions I was hoping we would talk about when it's over. So the first one is, How did science inform Hugh Ross and Francis Collins's search for spiritual truths? Then where did logic and reason take them in this spiritual and intellectual journey? What emotional struggles also contributed to their search? How did exploration of world religions fit into their path of discovery? And finally, what struggles and or joys did they experience at the moment of quote-unquote conversion and commitment to Jesus Christ and Christian faith? So here is, am I going to get this right? How do I? Francis Collins. Go back one and then forward. Do it again.
Look at these two images because we're about to talk about the worldview question. I think this is a provocative way to begin to think about that because what you see are two images that look somewhat similar to each other, but they stand in for somewhat different worldview perspectives. This being, of course, a beautiful stained glass window, the rose window in Westminster Cathedral. And this is an unusual view of DNA, not looking at it from the side, but looking down the long axis of DNA, so you see that radial pattern. And the question that many people pose, and which I pose to you tonight, is, okay, those are two worldviews, the scientific and the spiritual. Do you have to choose? Do you have to basically throw in your lot with one or the other and neglect the other one? Or is there a possibility here of being someone who could merge these two, not necessarily building a firewall between them, but actually having both of those perspectives within your own experience? I think many people today are arguing that these worldviews are at war and that there is no way to reconcile them. That has not been my experience. And that's what I particularly would like to share this evening. And then I hope we will have some time for questions from those of you who would like to pursue that in one way or another. So I think I owe you at this point a little bit more of a description about my spiritual perspective. I described my scientific pathway. How is it that I stand up here before you this evening in a distinguished university and talk about being a believer in God? Many of you might have assumed that the only scientists who were those who learned faith in childhood would have it later on, but that's not my story. I was raised in a family that was wonderfully unconventional. My father had been a folk song collector in the 1930s in North Carolina. After the war, he and my mother did the 60s thing, except it was still the 40s. And I don't think it involved drugs, but they did buy a dirt farm and tried to live off the land. And that didn't go very well. I discovered that that was not a credible way to have enough income to serve a growing family. I was born on that farm. By that time, my father had gone back to teaching at the local college, and my mother had started writing plays. And they founded a theater in the grove of oak trees up above our farmhouse, which I'm happy to say is about to have its 54th consecutive summer season. So I got raised in this wonderful mix of ideas, of music, of theater, the arts. My mother taught me at home until the 6th grade, which was also very unconventional in the 1950s. And she taught me to love the experience of learning new things. But the one thing I didn't learn much about was faith. My parents didn't really denigrate religion, but they didn't find it very relevant. And so when I got to college, I had those conversations that one has, even though I might have had some spiritual glimmers along the way, they quickly disappeared in those dormitory conversations where there's always an atheist who's determined to put forward that argument about why your faith is actually flawed, and mine wasn't even there at all. So it was pretty easy for the resident atheist to dismiss my leanings of any sort. I was probably an agnostic at that point, although I didn't know the word. And then I went off to graduate school and studied physical chemistry and very much was involved in a theoretical approach to trying to understand the behavior of atoms and molecules. And my faith really then rested upon second-order differential equations, which are pretty cool, by the way, but Just the same, I became increasingly of a reductionist mode and a materialist mode, and I had even less tolerance then for hearing information of a spiritual sort and considered that to be irrelevant. Some appropriately should be cast off information left over from an earlier time. But then I had a change of heart as far as what I wanted to do professionally. I loved what I was doing in chemistry, but I discovered that biology, which I had pretty much neglected, actually had a lot going for it. Recombinant DNA was being invented. There was some chance here that we might actually begin to understand how life works at a fundamental level. And realizing that that was a real calling for me, and also that I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be a researcher or a practitioner, I went to medical school. That had not been part of my life plan, and it's still rather amazing. The medical school let me in with that story, but they did. I arrived in medical school as an atheist, but it didn't last. Because in that third year of medical school, I found myself, as one does, taking care of patients. Wonderful people with terrible illnesses. Illnesses that medicine was not going to be able to solve in many instances. People who saw the approach of death, knowing what was coming, and to my surprise, seemed to be at peace about it because of their faith. That was puzzling. And as I tried to imagine myself in that situation, I knew I would not be at peace. I would be terrified. And that was a bit disturbing, but I tried to put it out of my mind until one afternoon when a wonderful elderly woman who was my patient, who had very advanced heart disease that we had run out of options for and who knew her life was coming to a close, told me in a very simple, sincere way about her faith and how that gave her courage and hope and peace about what was coming. And as she finished that description, she looked at me sort of quizzically as I sat there silently, feeling a little embarrassed, and she said, "Doctor, I've told you about my faith, and we've talked about my family, and I thought maybe you might say something." Oh. And then she asked me the most simple question. "Doctor, what do you believe?" Nobody had ever asked me that question before, not like that, not in such a simple, sincere way. And I realized I didn't know the answer. I felt uneasy. I could feel my face flushing. I wanted to get out of there. The ice was cracking under my feet. Everything was all of a sudden muddled by this simple question, "Doctor, what do you believe?" So that troubled me, and I thought about it a little bit and realized what the problem was. I was a scientist, or at least I thought I was, and scientists are supposed to make decisions after they look at the data, after they look at the evidence. I had made a decision that there was no God, and I'd never really thought about looking at the evidence. That didn't seem like a good thing. It was the decision that I wanted the answer to be, but I had to admit I didn't really know whether I had chosen the answer on the basis of reason or whether because it was a convenient form of perhaps willful blindness to the evidence. I wasn't sure there was any evidence, but I figured I'd better go find out because I didn't want to be in that spot again. So what did I do? Well, I figured there are those world religions. What do they believe? I better find out. And I tried to read through some of those sacred texts, and I got totally confused and frustrated. And there was no Wikipedia to help me either. It's much easier now. There's even a book on the shelf called World Religions for Dummies, but they didn't have that then either. So at a loss, I knocked on the door of a minister who lived down the road from me in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and said, "I don't know what these people are talking about, but I figure it's time for me to learn. So, okay, you must be a believer. At least I hope you are. You're a minister. Let me ask you some questions." So I asked him a bunch of probably blasphemous questions, and he was gracious about that. And after a while said, "You're on a journey here trying to figure out what's true. You're not the first one. And in fact, I've got a book here written by somebody who went on that same journey from an academic perspective. In fact, it was a pretty distinguished Oxford scholar. he found around him there were people who were believers, and he was puzzled about that, and he set about to try to figure out why people believe, and figured that he could shoot them down, and, well, why don't you read the book and see what happened? So he pulled this little book off the shelf, and I took it home and began to read. And in the first 2 or 3 pages, I realized that my arguments against faith were really those of a schoolboy. They had no real substance. And the thoughtful reflections of this Oxford scholar, whose name, of course, is C.S. Lewis, made me realize there was a great depth of thinking and reason that could be applied to the question of God. And that was a surprise. I had imagined faith and reason were at opposite poles. And here was this deep intellectual who was convincing me quickly, page by page, that actually reason and faith go hand in hand, though faith has the added component of revelation. Well, I had to learn more about that. Over the course of the next year, kicking and screaming most of the way, because I did not want this to turn out the way that it seemed to be turning out, I began to realize that the evidence for the existence of God, while not proof, was actually pretty interesting. And it certainly made me realize that atheism would no longer be for me an acceptable choice, that it was the least rational of the options. I won't go through the whole chronology as it actually happened, but let me summarize for you the kinds of arguments that ultimately brought me around to the position of recognizing that belief in God was an entirely satisfying intellectually event, but also something that I was increasingly discovering I had a spiritual hunger for. And interestingly, some of the pointers to God had been in front of me all along, coming from the study of nature, and I hadn't really thought about them, but here they were. Here's one which seems like an obvious statement, but maybe it's not so obvious. There is something instead of nothing. No reason that should be. This phrase of Wigner, the Nobel laureate in physics, caught my eye because I had been involved, of course, as a graduate student working with quantum mechanics with Schrödinger's equation. And one of the things that had appealed to me so much about mathematics and physics and chemistry was how it was that this particular kind of depiction of matter and energy works. I mean, it really works well. And a theory that is correct often turns out to be simple and beautiful. And why should that be? Why should mathematics be so unreasonably effective in describing nature? There's the Big Bang. The fact that the universe had a beginning, as virtually all scientists are now coming to the conclusion, about 13.7 billion years ago, in an unimaginable singularity, where the universe, smaller than a golf ball, suddenly appeared and then began flying apart and has been flying apart ever since. And we can calculate that singularity by noticing just how far those galaxies are receding from us and things like the background microwave radiation, the echo of that Big Bang. And of course, that presents a difficulty because our science cannot look back beyond that point. And it seems that something came out of nothing. Well, nature isn't supposed to allow that. So if nature's not able to create itself, how did the universe get here? You can't postulate that that was created by some natural force, or you haven't solved the problem, because then, okay, what created that natural force? So the only plausible, it seemed to me, explanation is that there must be some supernatural force that did the creating. And of course, that force would not need to be limited by space or even by time. Oh, now we're getting somewhere. So, all right, let's imagine there is a creator, let's call that creator God, who is supernatural, who's not bounded by space, not bounded by time, and is a pretty darn good mathematician. And it's starting to make some sense here. Well, God must also be an incredible physicist. Because another thing I began to realize by a little more reading is that there is this phenomenal fine-tuning of the universe that makes complexity and therefore life possible. Those of you who study physics and chemistry will know that there's a whole series of laws that govern the behavior of matter and energy. There are simple, beautiful equations, but they have constants in them, like the gravitational constant or the speed of light. And you cannot derive at the present time the value of those constants. They are what they are. They're givens. You have to do the experiment and measure them. Well, suppose they were a little different. Would that matter? Would anything change in our universe if the gravitational constant was a little stronger or a little weaker? Some days I think it's a little stronger, but I don't think it really is. So that calculation got done, particularly in the 1970s, by Barrow and Tipler. And the answer was astounding. That if you take any of these 15 constants and you tweak them just a tiny little bit, the whole thing doesn't work anymore. Take gravity, for instance. If gravity was just 1 part in about 10 billion weaker than it actually is, then after the Big Bang, there would be insufficient gravitational pull to result in the coalescence of stars and galaxies and planets and you and me. And you'd end up, therefore, with a infinitely expanding sterile universe. If gravity was just a tiny bit stronger, well, things would coalesce all right, but a little too soon. And the Big Bang would be followed after a while by a big crunch, and we would not have the chance to appear because the timing wouldn't be right. And that's just one example. You can't look at that data and not marvel at it. It is astounding to see the knife edge of improbability upon which our existence exists. So what's that about? Well, I can think of 3 possibilities. First of all, maybe theory will someday tell us that these constants have to have the value they have, that there is some a priori reason for that. Most physicists I talk to don't think that's too likely. There might be relationships between them that have to be maintained, but not the whole thing. A second possibility, perhaps we are one of an almost infinite series of other universes that have different values of those constants. And of course, we have to be in the one where everything turned out right, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. So that's the multiverse hypothesis, and it is a defensible one, as long as you're willing to accept the fact that you will probably never be able to observe those infinite series of other parallel universes. So that requires quite a leap of faith. The third possibility is that this is intentional, that these constants have the value they do because that creator God, who is a good mathematician, also knew that there was an important set of dials to set here if this universe that was coming into being was going to be interesting. So take those 3 possibilities, and which of them seems most plausible? Apply Occam's razor, if you will, which says that the simplest explanation is most likely correct. Well, I come down on number 3, especially because I've already kind of gotten there in terms of the other arguments about the idea of a creator. And this is interesting, but of course, so far, how far have we gotten? We've gotten to Einstein's God now, because Einstein certainly marveled at the way in which mathematics worked. Einstein was not aware, as far as we know, of the fine-tuning arguments at quite this level, but probably would have embraced them in the same way. But we haven't really gotten to a theist God yet. We've gotten to a deist God. So how do we get there? Well, now we come back to Lewis in that first chapter of Mere Christianity, which is called Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And here what is being talked about is the moral law. I didn't take philosophy in college, so I didn't really quite know what this was all about. But as I began to recognize what the argument was, it rang true. It rang true in a really startling way. One of those things where you realize, I've known about this all my life, but I've never really quite thought about it. So what's the argument? The argument is that we humans are unique in the animal kingdom by apparently having a law that we are under, although we seem free to break it because that happens every day. And the law is that there's something called right and there's something called wrong, and we're supposed to do the right thing and not the wrong thing. Again, we break that law. When we do, what do? We make an excuse, which only means we believe the law must be true and we're trying to be let off the hook. Now, people will quickly object, now wait a minute. I can think of human cultures that did terrible things. How can you say they were under the moral law? Well, if you go and study those cultures, you will find out that the things that we consider terrible were in their column called right because of various cultural expectations. So clearly the moral law is universal, but it is influenced in terms of particular actions and how they size up in the right and wrong assessment. Well, the moral law sometimes calls us to do some pretty dramatic things, particularly in terms of altruism, where you do something sacrificial for somebody else. And what about that? People may argue, and they have, and they will continue to, that this can all be explained by evolution, and those are useful arguments to look at. So for instance, if you're being altruistic to your own family, you can see how that might make sense from an evolutionary perspective, because they share your DNA. So if you're helping their DNA survive, well, it's yours too. And so that makes sense from a Darwinian argument about reproductive fitness. If you are being nice to somebody in expectation they'll be nice to you later, a reciprocal form of altruism, well, okay, you can see how that might also make sense in terms of benefiting your reproductive success. You can even make arguments, as Martin Nowak has at Harvard, that if you do computer modeling of things like the prisoner's dilemma, you can come up with motivations for entire groups to behave altruistically toward each other. But a consequence of that, and all the other models that have been put together, is that you still have to be hostile to people who are not in your group. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart as far as the evolutionary drive for successful competition. Well, does that fit? Is that what we see in our own experience? Where are those circumstances where we think the moral law has been most dramatically at work? I would submit they are not when we're being just nice to our family, or just nice to people who are going to be nice to us, or even just when we're being nice to other people in our own group. The things that strike us, that cause us to marvel and to say, that's what human nobility is all about, are when that radical altruism extends beyond those categories. When you see Mother Teresa and the streets of Calcutta picking up the dying, when you see Oskar Schindler risking his life to save Jews from the Holocaust, when you see the Good Samaritan, or when you see Wesley Autrey. Wesley Autrey, a construction worker, African-American, standing on the subway platform in New York City, and next to him, a young man, a graduate student, went into an epileptic seizure, and to the horror of everybody standing there, the student fell onto the tracks in front of an oncoming train. With only a split second to make a decision, Wesley jumped onto the tracks as well, pulled the student, still having the seizure, in that small space in between the tracks, covered him with his own body, and the train rolled over both of them. And miraculously, there was just enough clearance for them both to survive. And here's a picture of the next day, as Wesley describes the situation, standing next to the young man's father. This was clearly radical altruism. These people were of no acquaintance of each other, had no likelihood of seeing each other in any other circumstance, and belonged to different groups as we seem to define them here in our society, one being African American, one being white. And yet, New York went crazy, and they should. What an amazing act. What an amazing, risky thing to do. Now, evolution would say, Wesley, what were you thinking? Talk about ruining your reproductive fitness opportunities. This is a scandal, isn't it? So think about that. Again, I'm not offering you a proof, but I do think when people try to argue that morality can be fully explained on evolutionary grounds, that's a little bit too easy. That's a little bit too much of a just so story. And perhaps it might ought to be thought about as potentially having some other reflected reason for its presence. And I would ask the question, because Lewis asked it in his chapter, if you were looking not just for evidence of a God who was a mathematician and a physicist, but a God who cared about human beings and who stood for what was good and holy and wanted his people to also be interested in what is good and holy, wouldn't it be interesting to find written in your own heart this moral law which doesn't otherwise make sense and which is calling you to do just that? That made a lot of sense to me. So after going through these arguments over the course of a couple of years, and it was that long, fighting them, oftentimes wishing that I had never started down this road because it was leading me a place I wasn't sure I wanted to go, I began to realize that I had a certain series of immutable issues that were leading me in the direction of awe of something greater than myself. Reflected here by this phrase from Immanuel Kant, the philosopher. Two things fill me with constantly increasing admiration and awe. The longer and more earnestly I reflect on them, the starry heavens without and the moral law within. My goodness, that's just where I was. But I had to figure out then, okay, if there is the possibility of this kind of God and a God who cares about humans, what is that God really like? And now it was time to go back to the world's religions and try to figure out what they tell us about that. And as I read through them, now somewhat better prepared, I could see there were great similarities between the great monotheistic religions, and they actually resonated quite well with each other about many of the principles, and I found that quite gratifying and was a bit surprised because I had assumed that they were radically different. But there were differences. Now, about this time, I had also arrived at a point that was actually not comforting, which was the realization that if the moral law was a pointer to God, and if God was good and holy, I was not. And as much as I tried to forgive myself for actions that were not consistent with that moral law, they kept popping up. And therefore, just as I was beginning to perceive the person of God in this sort of blurry way, that image was receding because of my own failures. And I began to despair of whether this would ever be a relationship that I could claim or hope to have because of my own shortcomings. And into that area of increasing anxiety came the realization that there is a person in one of these faiths who has the solution to that. And that's the person of Jesus Christ, who not only claimed to know God, but to be God, and who in this amazing and incomprehensible at first, but ultimately incredibly sensible, uplifting, sacrificial act, died on the cross and then rose from the dead to provide this bridge between my imperfections and God's holiness in a way that made more sense than I ever dreamed it could. I had heard those phrases about Christ died for your sins, and I thought that was so much gibberish, and suddenly it wasn't gibberish at all. And so, 2 years after I began this journey on a hiking trip in the Cascade Mountains up in Oregon, with my mind cleared of those distractions that so often get in the way of realizing what is really true and important, I felt I had reached the point where I no longer had reasons to resist, and I didn't want to resist. I had a hunger to give in to this. And so that day, I became a Christian. That was 31 years ago. And I was scared, and I was afraid I was going to turn into somebody very somber and lose my sense of humor and probably be called to Africa the next week or something. But instead, I discovered this great sense of peace and a joyfulness about having finally crossed that bridge. And also to have done so in a fashion that seemed to live up to my hopes that faith would not be something you had to plunge into blindly, but something where there was, in fact, reason behind the decision.
All right, time for some discussion and reflection after hearing both of those stories. So I will just leave you to your table talk, and you can explore any of these questions in any order that you so choose. Our last scientist, James Tour. He's a research chemist and at Rice University. This man has so many credentials. It's incredible. He has PhD in synthetic organic and organometallic chemistry, Purdue University, postdoc in synthetic organic chemistry. He's a professor at Rice. He has over 650 research publications, over 200 patents. He was named as one of the 50 most influential scientists in the world today. He is a powerhouse, and his testimony is quite powerful. It's more emotional than the other ones you've heard, and this one is much shorter. But listen to James Tour.
I got my PhD in the field of organic chemistry, postdoc at Stanford University, joined the group of a man who was going to win a Nobel Prize in chemistry, voted one of the top 50 most influential minds in the world. I was a visiting scholar at Harvard University. I've spoken at every major university in this country, have over 650 research publications, voted the R&D magazine Scientist of the Year. I'm in the National Academy of Inventors. I'm a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, over 120 patents, started 7 or 8 companies. We work in areas that range from medicine to material science to electronics, computer memory, medical devices. We work across a broad range of areas. But more than any of that, what means the most to me is that I'm a Jew who believes that Jesus is the Messiah. I grew up just outside of New York City. I thought everybody was Jewish. I didn't even know that there was anything else. I had no particular interest in that, other than when all my friends were getting bar mitzvahed or bat mitzvahed, and then I would attend, of course, every week. There was never really any excitement for me. I remember once I even tried to talk to a rabbi. He just brushed me off. There was very little explanation for me. I remember when I went to college, I started meeting a number of people that said that they were born-again Christians, which was sort of an odd term. What's born again? What do you mean, born again? One person saw me in the laundry room. He said, "Do you mind if I give you an illustration of the gospel?" And I remember we sat there and he actually started to draw a picture. A cliff with a man on one side, and he drew a little man, and then another cliff with God on the other side, and a big chasm in between that he labeled with sin. And I looked at him, I said, "I'm not a sinner. I've never killed anyone. I never robbed a bank. How could I be a sinner?" And he had me read a verse from the Bible. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. In modern Judaism, we never really talked about sin. I don't remember ever talking about sin in my home. So he turned to another passage. Jesus said, "I say to you that everyone who looks upon a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Pow! I felt just as if I'd been punched right in the chest. Here I was, new in college. I didn't think anybody knew. I would pick up these magazines and I became addicted to pornography. It was just through those magazines. And all of a sudden, something that's written in the Bible, somebody who lived 2,000 years ago is calling me out on it. And I felt immediately convicted. And that now I realized I was a sinner. When I read in the scriptures what sin is, then I knew I was a sinner. How am I going to get to God? We Jews know this better than anyone else. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. This description in Isaiah 53 of how he will bear upon himself my sin, the things that I had done, and this was him. This was the man that took this upon himself on the cross. The perfect God comes and gives himself for us. He is the one that gives himself for us. I started to realize how Jewish the New Testament is. This book is so Jewish. The New Testament is so Jewish. It's all around Jewish people. And then on November 7th, 1977, I was all alone in my room. The realization that Yeshua is the one who died on the cross. And I said, "Lord, I am a sinner. Please forgive me. Come into my life." And then all of a sudden, someone was in my room. And I opened my eyes. I was on my knees. I opened my eyes. Who's in my room? That man, Jesus Christ, stood in my room. this amazing sense of God. Jesus was in my room, and I wasn't scared. All I started doing was just weeping. The presence was so glorious because he was there in my room on that day. And I didn't want to get up. And this amazing sense of forgiveness just started to come upon me. That was him. Finally, I got up. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to tell. Here's this Jewish kid from New York City. What am I going to say? My cousins were shocked. How could you do that? You're Jewish. Telling my mother how I had invited Jesus into my life. She didn't say much. She was weeping. She told my father they weren't happy at all. And she said, I don't blame them for killing Jesus after the things that he said. Who is he to come against these religious leaders that have dedicated their lives to helping people and to tell them that they are whitewashed tombs? Who is he, this young man in his 30s, to say this to these scholars? He got what he deserved. And my mother's a very deep, pensive, careful reader. She read from Genesis right on through the Tanakh, the whole thing. When she got done, I said, what did you think? She said, God warned us over and over again. He warned us. When my daughter was about 15, my mother and father came to visit us. At one point, my mother went into her room for several hours. She came out. She said, quite a young girl you have. She talked to me for a long time. She started reading the Bible again, both the Old and the New Testament. One day, not long after that, she called me on the phone at the age of 72. She said, Jimmy, you wouldn't believe what happened. I said, what happened? She said, I was just reading. And it hit me. It hit me. The way he gave his life. I believe it now. Jesus is the Son of God.
I think we're almost out of time, though. So I guess at this point, I would just like to, we've had two groups discussing. Maybe we could end it with any comments from any of you about these three stories, or what's your takeaway?
I think for me, it's you have three individuals, with three individual lives, three individual stories, and about how they came to believe what they did. It seems to me the common thread is the fourth character, right? God was moving in each of their lives to bring them to a place where they needed to come to grips with reality.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I really appreciate is that they are people who you can't take away from their credentials.
Mm-hmm.
These are people who you automatically confer upon them respect because of their credentials.
Mm-hmm.
And then you hear their stories and you realize that they're not crackpots, they're not weak-minded people, they're not people who need a crutch. They're strong, intelligent, thinking individuals who come to a reasoned conclusion. It's, even though it can be, as James was wonderfully emotional, it's also very reasonable.
That might be a great place to end it, too. Thank you all for your participation, and I hope some of these stories contribute to your faith journey.
Thank you. Thanks, great.